was very good and easy to understand. You should write one for that. वो तो नहीं होने वाला.
No, that's impossible.
No, I have another project in mind. I mean, actually, I have two possible things I might be doing. I don't know which one I'll get to first. I have the title for one I really like. It's called Waiting in Line for Two Poems by Robert Frost.
Waiting in line for?
Two poems by Robert Frost.
Achha.
But it's going to be about economics.
Yeah, of course.
I like your mug.
Oh, thank you. As normally we have Christmas party, but this year we didn't have Christmas party. So I got these made for the department as Christmas gifts for everyone.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, हमें तो कुछ नहीं मिला.
Mila hai, Tarun.
Yeah.
He got Diwali mithai or something.
कुछ नहीं आया. मेरे को नहीं मिला.
मिल जाएगा.
आया.
I'm drinking from Yukon Cup.
Oh, वो भी अच्छा है. Good things come to those who wait.
Yeah.
I have a free diary if that counts for something.
Oh, nice.
हमें भेज दो. Diary, mug, Virginia Tech का mug, Penguin की diary.
What mug?
I don't need to also publish a book with us. We'll also give you free stuff. Lots of free.
मुझे भी चाहिए वो डायरी फिर. मुझे भी नहीं है. मेरे पास भी नहीं है.
For that, you have to come and meet us.
These are like conditions. No, do this एक diary मिलेगी. नहीं फिर वो भी करो. फिर एक diary मिलेगी.
I'm sure you can explain this by economics.
Oh, yeah.
So everyone.
Yes.
Now we are live on YouTube.
Okay.
And now participants are joining. Now 23 participants are there.
Great. That's so exciting.
Yeah, I see 30 participants. Yeah. 23 participants.
So shall we start? Or? So
Yeah.
I'll give you small.
Let's just give it till 5:35 so that everybody who is
Okay.
trying to
Right
join.
now it's 23. Let's wait for 2 minutes and then.
Yeah.
I see Ritvik is here.
Yeah, Ritvik is here. Hi, Ritvik. He can't say anything, I think.
Yeah, he can't.
We can allow people to talk. Huh?
It's a webinar. That's why if we.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, we don't allow people to talk. Otherwise, it gets like out of hand.
Exactly.
I see my friend Arnav Roy is here. I see Professor Dwarika Unniyal is here. Nice. I see Sudipta Acharya is here. Oh, nice. Viral, of course, there are other people who might be on YouTube, and those are people.
Yeah, exactly, sir. Yeah, exactly, sir. Because we have just shared YouTube link in our community, Facebook, Twitter, everywhere we just shared YouTube link also.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Oops. It's 30 7 participants.
I got a link for the YouTube.
Yes.
The YouTube link just now. Yeah.
Shall we start? It's okay. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Vikram Sarabhai Library, I am Ahmedabad. I welcome you all to our online book talk program. For today's book talk, we have Professor Sudipta Sarangi, the author of the book The Economics of Small Things, which I have in my hand. We would really thank Professor Sudipta Sarangi for kindly agreeing to review his newly published. I also welcome Professor Rita Dev and Professor Tarun Jain from IIMA Ahmedabad will joining conversation with Professor Sudipta Sarangi. We also have Ms. Shreya Punch, the editor of this book. She will moderate this session and I welcome Ms. Shreya. There will be 45-minute session or conversation. Then after we will take question and answer, during the session, you can take questions and answers also. So now I hand over to Ms. Shreya Punch.
Thank you so much, Viral. Hello, everyone. I'm Shreya, and I work at Penguin Random House. And I'm so happy and delighted that you're all joining us for this conversation today, which is being hosted by IIM Ahmedabad. I'll first speak a little bit about the book and then hand over the reins of this conversation to the 3 people who are best suited to have this, since it's on economics. Economics is a tough subject, and this is coming from an engineer who had the dreaded combination of physics, chemistry, maths with biology in school. Everything I know about economics has come from Googling everything Dr. Sarangi talks about in his book and realizing that things like game theory, the Cobra effect, the third law of demand, O-ring theory, and all these previously jargon-filled topics have very easily been explained by Dr. Sarangi using everyday life examples. And this is why I think this book is a must read for people who enjoy, reading a good book which teaches them something new with each passing page. In conversation with us today are Associate Professors Preetha Dev and Tarun Jain, whose long list of achievements and varied interests in subjects of economics left me feeling quite dwarfed with their achievements. So they also both have an interest in microeconomics. And as you'll realize in this conversation, I think the 3 people who are talking today are more friends and than colleagues, because the banter is going to be quite lovely. I now hand over the reins to the star of the evening, author Sudipta Sarangi, who has a small presentation prepared for us. And he also will be reading an excerpt from the book so that, we open the way for questions and great conversation. Dr. Sarangi, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shreya, and thank you, Viral. Thank you, IIM Ahmedabad, for organizing this event. We live in very strange times. We're doing this without chai and samosa. The book begins with chai and Mari biscuit, but this is without chai and samosa. I have my own cup of coffee. So good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. I know there are some people joining in from England. So good afternoon to them. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you, Pritha and Tarun again. Right. So I really thought that I will have a very few slides just to get things going. So I'm going to do screen share so that you can see the slides, and then I will talk about the book. Okay, so. So economics of small things, as you already know, the title is, and to really put some substance to what Shreya was talking about. If Tarun and I and Pritha and I were talking between us, this is what we'd be talking about: a walk in H, or something like a nested split graph, or maybe even cat's bonnets at centrality. So yeah, in that sense, Shreya is right, but we're not going to talk about these kinds of things today. The idea today is to talk about something very different. And that, I think, some of you might know, many of you actually might know, this is a very famous painting by the French surrealist René Magritte. And this is called The Son of Man. So Magritte had this idea that, people are interested in what you can't see. His goal was always to shock people. And what he would do is he would make paintings where there was something unexpected. So for example, if you look carefully at this painting, there's a green apple that covers the face. But behind that, if you look very carefully, you can see the two eyes, right? So at least one very beady looking eye, you can see very clearly. And the other one is kind of hidden behind the leaves, but you can see a bit of the eyes. And he would argue that people are interested in what's behind the apple, and they really want to find out. And so in that sense, the philosophy of this book is exactly that there is economics in our everyday lives, in everything we do. And in some ways, my goal has been to uncover that. In many ways, it is a labor of love. Okay, I really enjoyed working on this. There have been lots of people who have been instrumental as a part of this journey. For sure, Professor Kaushik Basu, who, if he had not asked me to write a book, I would never have done this, right? So he's the one who said, you should put these ideas together into a book. He came here in March 2019 to give a talk, and that's when we had this conversation, and that's how this book happened. But really, I mean, this love for reading and writing, actually, I will say, goes back to my elementary school teachers, who I actually thank in the book, right? So it's been a long journey. There have been many people like Pritha, Tarun, Dwari, Indro. It's all part of this long set of conversations that lead to ideas like this. So I will just, to give you a flavor, I want to start with only just one idea, and then we'll see where. So now this picture, for some of you, you may not have ever used these things, but just to give you a sense, many of us have. And when I talk about technology like this, what really comes to my mind is this song, right? I can't stop thinking about this song, because if you remember the movie, the conflict happens because the other technology is taking over, right? So change in technology has always been a part of our lives. But the way technology changes affects us in a big way. So one of the things I want to talk about, of course, today, we live in this age of streaming services. But once upon a time, we had something like this. This is what used to run our lives. Some of you may not have seen these, but the idea was on the weekend, you would go to the video store, rent out a video cassette, come watch it on the weekend. So one of the chapters in the book talks about this idea. So imagine you live in a college town and you can rent a video cassette for 5 rupees for one night. Okay. So you rented it on Friday night. You don't manage to watch it on Friday night. You can go and re-rent it again to the video store. So you go to the video store and say, you know what, Bhaiya, I want to rent it for another day. You can rent it for another day for 5 rupees. That's fine. Suppose you don't go there on Saturday. He automatically charges you a fine, a late fine, which is $10 or 10 rupees. Okay, sorry. I get my monetary units confused. So, which is 10 rupees. Now, this should make you wonder what the heck is going on. If they are willing to rent you a movie for 5 rupees every night. Why is the late fee 10 rupees? Because that exceeds the opportunity cost, right? 5 rupees is what it costs. They're willing to rent it to you for that. So you could argue, well, that's probably because they want to deter people from not returning the movie on time. So maybe you charge that. But I went around and talked to some of these stores at that time. This is actually a true story. So I went around and talked to some of these stores. And it turns out that these video rental stores were making a third of their revenues through late fees. In fact, if you look at the reading list in the book, there is a story about how the founder of Netflix started Netflix because he hated these late fees. He hated these late fees charged by Blockbuster and companies like that. So let me give you a different explanation. So imagine that you live in a college town, okay? There are two kinds of people, professors and students. Students have a low opportunity cost of time, and professors have high opportunity cost of time. People like Pritha, me, Tarun, we are busy people, okay? So what the video store should do, it should reduce the price of the video rental very low so that we all rent movies. At the time of renting, none of us wants to be late. Although we have an idea that, bad things could happen. My daughter might get sick or something, then I'll get late, I won't be able to do it. So under certain distribution of parameters, it would make complete sense for the video store to reduce the rental price so people rent more, okay? And then those who have high value of time, like the professors, will get late, and the video store will collect a lot more money through them, through the rental price, while students will return on time. So that way, the video store is able to get both type of consumers and make more money from the one that has a higher value of time, right? So it's a very nice way to think about price discrimination. So this is explained in the book as an example of price discrimination. Of course, there are other ways you can think about price discrimination, but this is a very simple way to think about price discrimination. So this is something that credit cards also do. If there is credit card competition, what they'll do is they'll lower the interest rate. So you are willing to get their credit card, and they'll figure out all kinds of fees to charge you. So there's also a paper done by some finance professors that follows up on this paper of mine to explain this idea, right? So that's why I said once upon a time, Dobara. This is an overview of the contents for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the book. In fact, it starts by talking about the unholy trinity of moral hazard, adverse selection, and costly auditing, all in the context of Grameen Bank. In God We Trust is about wearing seat belts. And why people in India will refuse to wear a seatbelt when driving, but then every time they pass a mandir, they'll do this, right? So, but they'll refuse to wear the seatbelt. Then, the lessons from stolen shoes has very funny stories, but it's about complementarity. In these days of Corona, it's hard to get domestic help. Why we should pay our domestic help more, talks about these kinds of ideas. So there is this Ahmedabad. So I should mention that there is definitely an essay on Gandhi in the book. Of course, I can't leave out cricket. There is something on cricket. And really, one of the chapters I really like has to do with the first piece of cake and the last piece of cake. The chapter on palaces, Raki, and game theory is a bit of a detour. It goes into, it talks about Istanbul. So it's more really about a trip to Istanbul, but that was for the International Game Theory Congress. So there's a little bit of game theory, but it's mostly about Istanbul. One chapter that also, before I hand over, let other people chime in, I want to talk about, because we live in a world where politics has become, today we live in a much more polarized world than before. And so in this context, if you think about it, you will see there's one particular game that's all around us, right? So this is called the game of chicken. And what happens in the game of chicken? So for example, negotiation between Trump and North Korea, or Trump and Xi Jinping, the idea is that reputation is more important. In fact, it's even more important than dying. So one way to think about the game of chicken is two people sitting in front of each other, holding their breath. The first one to stop holding their breath is the winner. But then if you keep holding your breath forever, you will die, right? But in the game of chicken, you want to be winner so desperately that you're willing to do that. That's why we have, border skirmishes all the time. The people who pay for those skirmishes are the people out there fighting on both sides. Although, political leaders on either side cannot back down because it's very difficult for them. It's all about reputation. Of course, the game of chicken, the idea goes back to this very famous movie, Rebel Without a Cause, James Dean, right, where two cars will race towards the edge of the cliff. The first person to veer off loses. In the end, of course, bad things happen to the villain dies, James Dean wins, but that's a whole different story. And in these days of COVID-19, this is the story that resonates. So that's Robin Hood and Little John, two people walking towards each other, but we need social distancing, right? So, and the strip on which you are walking is narrow. Who's going to give way to whom? This is exactly the game of chicken, right? So if you have very high unwillingness to give in, then you will keep heading towards each other, which does not help. So that, again, so the game of chicken has been around for a long time, but I think in today's polarized world, it is really important. And the other thing that you think about when you think about the game of chicken is this. All right. In the game of chicken, why did I have this? Well, we all know Kangana Ranaut and we all know attitude matters. But the game of chicken is really a game where attitude matters. Why? So if you think about this, just before you get into the car, okay, if you open a whole bottle of vodka and drink it, then the other person knows that I'm playing with somebody who's crazy. In the game of chicken, if you take off the steering wheel of the car as you are driving towards each other, then you are telling the other person, look, I'm crazy, I don't care. So attitude, or what you show people, in that sense, you don't necessarily have to have that attitude. For example, we used to have this guy when I was a student in the hostel who would pretend he was drunk and pick up fights with people he wanted to pick up a fight with, so that next morning he could apologize and say, oh, I was drunk, I did that. But really, he wasn't drunk. If you knew him, he was doing this deliberately because he didn't have an open way to pick up a fight with you, right? So attitude matters in the game of chicken. With that, I am going to stop. By the way, this month, we are running a little competition. So that's the email for the book. If you email questions that appeal to me, then the 3 best questions will get a prize. I am on Twitter. And the book also has a website. It's very easy to remember, econsmallthings.com. And the email is also econsmallthings.com. So with that, I am going to stop sharing screen and let the Adda begin with everybody else.
Thank you, Sudipta. Sorry,
I was just saying the same thing, that Preetha and Tarun, you may now begin discussing the microeconomics at play, both in the book and in the workplace that you all work at.
Thank you, Sudipta. It was a pleasure reading the book. It was all these examples popping out, and you could really, that photo that you started off with the apple in front of the face, and you remove the apple and then you see the face. That's exactly what was happening. So a lot of basic facts being uncovered so nicely, and it was just it was a breeze to read through it. So I'll sort of talk about one of the chapters which got me, which is one of the first chapters I read, was the one on domestic workers. So, all of us moving into India suddenly had to deal with this concern of how to manage staff. We never had staff before we came to India. And suddenly we have, extensive numbers of people who are working on us, who are dependent on us. And you proposed a very nice solution. So do you think it's happening? Do you think your relatives are actually going ahead? You say that we should just pay our domestic help more. Do you think that's actually happening with your relatives?
So very good question. I know that my sister actually does that. And this idea came about with a conversation. I have a friend who has a similar contract with her domestic help, and conversation with her is what led to this idea. So I would not say that all my relatives are doing this, but the idea is that, so what's the idea that Preetha is referring to? It's something we call efficiency wages, where the idea is that if it is hard to keep certain types of workers, and it's not our idea, it's not something the economists came up with, it's actually Henry Ford who came up with this idea, right? So he introduced this idea of paying workers more than the market rate. especially if you have a good worker, because if the minute you pay them more than the market rate, they're not going to leave your employment for somebody else. So Pritha, yes, you're right. So I was talking to Chandan, for example, who talks about the fact that his mother living in the village is just unwilling to accept efficiency wage theory. I'm not sure where my parents stand exactly on this, but my sister does believe in the efficiency wage theory. So yeah, it's true for some, not for others. It is sensitive.
So I think, it might make Chandan's mother might be perfectly rational about that because she lives in a village. So she has someone working for them. It's not as if they can run away very far to another employer. Whereas if you're in a city, you have lots of other employers where you can go to, right?
Yeah. So precisely. So that's why the important caveat is to understand that if you have somebody who's very good and you're afraid they will leave, then you need to be worrying about this.
So I love this book, right? So I mean, it's so easy to read. It's like, there's no less painful way to learn microeconomics principles than to read Sudipta's book, right? So I mean, I think that's the way to describe it. A lot of textbooks are going to go out of business, right? So Shreya, don't publish textbooks anymore because you won't sell them, right? So I think that's the nice thing, that microeconomics is becoming less and less about doing hard maths and more about looking around the world and saying, hey, wait a minute, everything is in some ways, you look at like human behavior and you look at human beings. And if you just apply like tools of microeconomics, you can predict a lot, or at least you can explain a lot, right? Of how people behave. And it's so much fun to do that. Once you like understand that, it's a bit of a drug, right? Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. For people like us, I think, who do this on a routine basis, it's very much like a drug, and you're always looking for new things where you can spot this kind of behavior, or you explain these kinds of things to people. So, for example, in my classes, I often talk about why people overeat in a buffet. I don't have that in the book, but I talk about why people overeat in a buffet. And as soon as you explain that to people, they say, "Oh yeah, it makes sense," because in an a la carte menu, you are paying for every item. In a buffet, once you are in the room, you're not paying the marginal cost of eating anything more is zero. So naturally, our brains tell us, "Oh, come on, you can eat that. You can eat that." And pretty soon, you've overeaten, right? So microeconomic principles are all around us. We just have to pay attention and spot those ideas.
Sudipta, since you were just talking about my personal favorite topic of eating, can you tell me how do you explain the rationale of people either leaving the last slice of pizza, or some people who, like your daughter, actually do manage to go ahead and grab the first slice of cake because, well, they know they have to eat it. So how do you explain that with economic theory? And I'd love for Preetha and Tarun to also weigh in on this, and if they were to answer this question in their classrooms, how they'd answer it.
Okay, thank you. So these are two related chapters. I start with the first one is called the first piece of cake, and the idea is, why do you offer the first piece of cake to a guest? Okay, and in fact, it started because my daughter has a friend who visits her for a play date, and then in the middle of the play date, sort of every time they have to be given something to eat. So I offer them. So once I go, I offer them 2 pieces of chocolate, one of those Lindt chocolates. And my daughter doesn't wait for her friend; she grabs the first piece herself. So of course later, I have a talk with her. Why do you do that? You have to let the guest choose. And her answer was, well, I know what she wants. I took the one she doesn't want. Why does it matter if I have to give it to her? And why does she have to choose first? And if you think about it, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. Survival instincts suggest that she should eat first, forget about the other person. And also efficiency, at least economic efficiency, says, let's find out who's the hungriest, give the food to the person that's the hungriest. Then we go down, we write down the order of people in terms of their hunger and then give them food.
Chocolates. No one's hungry. They just want to eat chocolate. Everyone.
So then I use that to talk about how we. So I won't go into details on that one. I want people to read the chapter in the book. But basically, I come up with an explanation for why we have things like Atithi Devo Bhava. What's the point? Why do we do that? And I'm not going to reveal the answer. But I'll talk about the last piece of cake. The last piece of cake is another very interesting phenomenon. Of course, it doesn't happen inside the house, right? I mean, it doesn't happen with people who know you very well and all of that. In fact, then you might be fighting for the last piece. I'm going to have this. But, if you are in a group where it's mostly acquaintances and people who don't know each other very well, then people may do this out of politeness to show that they are nice. But actually, it goes beyond that. And now you have shown that you're nice, and the other people know that you're nice, and you know that the other people know that you're nice, and so on. And you can all argue that if everyone doesn't take the last piece of cake, everyone is telling everyone that they are nice. And now everyone knows that they're nice, and everyone knows that everyone knows they're nice, and everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows they're nice, and so on, up to infinity. And this chain of beliefs is what's called common knowledge. And common knowledge is very important for creating knowledge and actually for playing games. So that's kind of what I explained in that chapter, which is why nobody takes the last piece of cake. And there are funny stories in Minnesota, how apparently in Minnesota, this is a big deal. There's even a website, the Cursed Last Bites of Minnesota. So people keep slicing the cake finer and finer. So there's still a little crumb left. They'll keep eating. So yeah, I don't know if you guys have alternative explanations or if you have an alternative take on the first piece of cake or the last piece of cake you want to add to this story.
I was just, from what you were saying, I was like, after 5 minutes, when common knowledge is settled inside, somebody should eat it.
Sorry, go ahead, Sudipta.
No, I was just going to go back to zero marginal cost. And I was going to throw a question at both Tarun and Sudipta about the fact that, now we have zero marginal cost. It means that we are collecting a lot of stuff on our phones. Good morning, good evening, 3-minute long videos. And that's clearly, you say at some point in your book, it's not costless.
It's not.
Not anymore. I feel overwhelmed by all of this stuff that I will have to delete eventually. So do we have some tricks to change people's behavior or our behavior? Get out of this trap of zero marginal cost?
So I'll tell you one answer, and then I want to see what Tarun said. I'm not on WhatsApp. So at least that one I'm escaping.
How do you live? How do you like?
Yes.
He lives peacefully. That's how.
No, so I think this is essentially like the information overload. So it's not just on WhatsApp that we're. So this is, I think correct for lots and lots of things out there. So to get email costs zero now, at least to the sender for you to copy people, right? And so we're suffering from a lot of that. And so what the thing which is very costly for human beings is our mental space, right? And so this is particular. So it's fine, that you and I and all of us have devoted a lot of our time and attention, and this is, I think, true for most successful managers, most successful, bureaucrats, anyone who's achieved, a certain amount of success, is that they learn how to organize their minds to remove the clutter from their lives and only focus on what's important, right? But it becomes very difficult. So I think, you have this very nice chapter on economics of mental, on scarcity particularly mental scarcity amongst the poor. They spend a lot of time dealing with stuff that they should not be dealing with. And so when we think about, economists' favorite human being, Homo economicus, rational human beings, and so the poor suffer from that mental scarcity a lot, right? So they're dealing with a lot of stuff. It's a lot of things that they have to think about. There's new research that says that poor also suffer from lack of sleep, right? And so imagine that you're, sleeping 2 hours a day or 3 hours a day, and so therefore, how can you process things? And then, so I think I'm sympathetic to our predicament that we suffer from too much email and WhatsApp, but I also think about like lots of people who've been suffering this for years, right? It's not just
So I will say, as department head, it's really the number of emails I get. So yeah, while I'm not on WhatsApp, the number of emails I get as department head, especially during COVID, just I can't keep up. But I really think that, in the future, one of the most important commodities is, people say information. I think it's attention. So we are moving into the phase that where information is not going to be the commodity, but attention. People's attention is what we're going to be fighting for. That's that kind of difficulty we are facing, and we need models of understanding attention. I mean, there's already work on rational inattention and things like that, but we really need models of that.
So, let me ask you, so my favorite, perhaps my favorite microeconomics idea is signaling, right? And particularly as a business school professor, I sort of scratch my head and say, are all the students basically here to signal, right? Or do you actually learn anything in business school which is useful, right? And as economics professors in business school, we always suffer through that existentialist crisis, right? That our students could be simply signalers who go out, suffer through 2 years of business school to indicate that they're interested in business careers. And therefore, if you're willing to suffer through 2 years of business school, you will be willing to suffer through years and years of investment banking and management consulting jobs. So can you just talk a little bit more? I mean, I love the example that there's in your book, right? So there's the example of the pen, which is a signal, right? But there's, yeah.
So I was going to say the pen is actually a true story. So there is somebody, there is Professor Rao in IIT Bombay, and there's a true story about Professor Rao. So this whole episode about the village postmaster who yelled at him for not having a pen is actually a true story, and he, to date, doesn't leave his house without the pen. And I've also heard his PhD students say, why the heck does he always carry this fountain pen, right? So it's true. But, as Tarun was saying, this has to do with the idea of signaling. Now, I have to say that I don't think you should have an existential question. With teachers like Tarun and Pritha, I think those students are learning stuff. Okay,
so you think the treatment effects are real? Okay, go ahead. No, sorry for it.
No. I think they are learning stuff. But I think you are very correct in pointing out what is very important also, right? So I think business schools do two things. One is the signal value, and second is the peer effects, right? So if in the early days, I remember LinkedIn used to tell you, like so-and-so business school has the average graduate from so-and-so business school has so many LinkedIn connections, right? So this is the idea that networks are important, which is all something that all three of us do research in. And networks provide information, networks help you get jobs, all these kinds of things. So what the business school does, one thing it does for sure, is that helps you build a cohort. In fact, one of the reasons people do executive education is exactly for that. They get to know other mid-level and senior executives in other companies, and almost certainly as soon as they finish an executive MBA, people switch jobs. I mean, that's almost, I think if you look at that statistics, it's probably within a year, it's probably 100% of people who switch their job. So for sure, one of the things that a business school does is that it provides you access to a group of people who are like-minded, who are competitive, who are willing to go out on a limb, creative, and all of that, and you get connected into this group. The other thing that Tarun mentioned is an idea that goes back to Spence, which is called signaling. And the idea behind signaling is to say that, okay, you may have abilities, but people don't know your ability. Your ability is not written here. Okay, very smart. It's not written here. And so suppose let's say that I have somebody who's very smart in my class, but since it's not written here, I can also pretend to be as smart as them. So then what this person has to do, of course, if it's a verifiable attribute, my friend Arnab Roy, who's here, who's an excellent cricketer, we never understood how he didn't make it to the state team and beyond. If you compare his cricketing skills with my cricketing skills, it takes you 2 minutes to figure out, right? So it has to be something that you cannot verify. And then people do things like getting an education, even if the education does not necessarily help. So if you go get yourself a degree from a very highly acclaimed educational institution, what are you telling? You're telling your employer that, look, I'm different from the other guy because I could get into this really nice place which is very hard to get into. And I got myself an education from there, which means I have high ability, even if the high ability doesn't necessarily help in the job. So again, signaling has to be costly, because if signaling is not costly, everybody can do it, right? So signaling needs that it has to be costly, and not everybody can engage in it. It should be when it relates to unobservable characteristics, not observable things like cricket, where everybody knows Arnab is better than me. And so things like that. And I think that's the other thing a very good business school does. It provides people an opportunity to signal that, look, I have these abilities. It's not really what I learned in the classroom. But that is important. I'm not saying that's not important. Okay. I mean, if I have to do accounting.
We received 3 questions. And I thought I wanted to ask one of these because I think it'll just be a nice segue into this conversation. It's by Mr. Nilesh, and he's asking, is economics limited to only numbers, or has it become larger in spectrum like strategy, planning, execution, production, and many more areas like these, just like the internet? And I'd love for all of you to answer this one.
So we think economics has given rise to all the subjects within the business school, right?
Fair enough.
No, being facetious, but yeah, definitely larger than just numbers. So I'd like Sudipta and Tarun take on.
So economists tend to be a little bit like the philosophers of business school, right? So we provide the ideas, and I think that's the fun part of being an economist. It's that we have some good ideas. They largely seem like common sense. They seem sensible. So fortunately, economists have been, at least microeconomists have been saved from absolutely rank crazy ideas. So sometimes macroeconomists do suffer from that. Right? I think, what is the latest one, MMT or something like that? But so the microeconomics is it's full of ideas. They tend to be boring ideas because they make sense, right? So in that sense, we can't go completely crazy on society. But the aspect of numbers is just an incidental issue, right? So Sudipta showed that slide, so we should see that slide again. And that's just the sort of people who become economists tend to be nerds, and so and nerds love maths, and so we do maths for that. And if we had to teach all of economics without any maths, I think we could do that as well, and that would be fine. I wouldn't have a problem.
I would sign up for.
Yeah, I couldn't agree less with these guys. I mean, really, as Tarun said, it's about a way of thinking. So it pervades everything. It's about, it's, as he said, we are philosophers. It's the methodology, what underlies behavior more generally in all of these operations. But you can also think of sociological phenomena, political phenomena, evolutionary phenomena, and try to see what economic motives drive behavior. Now there's even something called neuroeconomics, right? Where people put electrodes on your brain and analyze your decision making to see which parts of the brain act when you're making different types of decisions. So for example, does a certain part of your brain act up more when you are being kind to others? Or can we stimulate a particular part of your brain and see if you will end up being kind? So interesting.
The next question I have is by Miss Sucharita Saha, who's asking, very sweetly, I might add, but she'd love to know what got you interested in economics in the first place. And again, I'd like all 3 of you to answer it because, you're all clearly in love with the subject.
So who wants to go first?
You should.
All right. So I've always been interested in human behavior. And so my father used to teach at REC Rourkela. And back then when I said I don't want to do engineering, there was, for the last 2 years of my +2, there was a big brouhaha every day at home. So I wanted to do economics. Also, I had economics in high school. So I had some exposure. Then I did economics. And then I think at some point, if you're at Delhi University, you're close to D School. Kaushik Basu came and gave talks. Several other people gave talks. And you find this very fascinating. And so then I want to do a master's. And then the next logical step after D School is you get into PhD. That's how it was for me.
I think it was somewhat similar for me. Like a big, not wanting to do engineering or medical. having economics, and then just rolling from one thing to another, and then you meet people who, or you meet teachers who are sort of suddenly open up horizons for you. And when I was at ISI Delhi, I mean, we had fantastic teachers all around, but I particularly remember Ornava Sen as being just eye-opening, and in explaining game theory as if it was in such a beautiful way that you are addicted for life basically after that. And then you see all the good things. And I mean, I'd say my love for economics came a lot later, during the PhD and afterwards, when you start seeing how it answers questions. And it answers questions for me specifically regarding inequality, about how things are different for different communities. And we're able to answer so many of those questions, or at least try to understand where it's happening.
It's so cool that the game theory thread is so common, right? Because I did economics in +2 and I did economics as undergrad, and I think the central motivation was that I'll get a better job, right? So it sounds like business, so
it was an economic motive.
Yeah, it's an economic motive, right? So I mean,
yeah.
In that sense, it sounds sensible. So then I ran into this book after I finished undergrad. My main undergrad subject was maths, and then I took some econ courses as well. So I read this book called Thinking Strategically, right? Which is by Avinash Dixit, Barry Nailbaf, all those guys, right? So those guys are fun. I mean, and so again, it's a book without much maths. It's a lot of game theory. It's a lot of signaling, all these new ideas, information theory. And, the moment you start to be exposed to those ideas, you're getting outside the standard, well, there's a demand curve. Yes, there's a supply curve. Yes, you start. And so once you go into that realm, I think it's economics just, says, wait a minute, economics can be about many, many things beyond what the firm does for production and what consumers do for consumption, right? And so, so a lot of my PhD research was about stuff like economics of the family, right? And so what explains, so can you come up with like entirely sensible theories of why is there a preference for boys versus girls without getting into inherently discriminatory attitudes, right? So if you say things like, well, parents are going to live with their sons, right? And bequest sons their land, right? In agricultural societies, right? So just because you cannot move land. Whereas women get dowries in the form of movable assets because they're going to move to their husband's house as far away. And if you just take like basic principles like that, you can explain so much of gender discrimination thing, and so being pushed to write that down and say, let's not have discrimination and yet create discrimination, and how social structures create that. I think that's powerful, right? And you don't have, so that to me sounds to be that people are basically good, but you can get into bad traps. And helping people get out of those traps and creating a more equal society is, I think, worth it. On the margin, there aren't a lot of economists around, but the influence that we can have in terms of just better world is, I think, huge. And it's basically
the original question is, if you look at the title of Adam Smith's book, was an inquiry into the causes of wealth of nations. Right? So indeed, one of the things that policy aims to address is exactly what Tarun was saying, things like inequality. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of those questions are related to economics, right? Gender discrimination, climate change, inequality, sustainability. These all have economic arguments underlying them. And in that sense, policy influence is important. So, Shreya, I will pick up a question that has been bothering me. So actually two questions. One very quick one for Tarun, and one, there is somebody who wants to know that if I just have a newfound love for economics.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that right now.
But go ahead. Tarun, Yeah, I want to know from Tarun why his Twitter handle is called Hyderabadi Chai.
I mean, I was living in Hyderabad when I started my Twitter account, and I wanted a unique thing which referred to nothing. And so there is nothing such as Hyderabadi chai. And so if you have chai in Hyderabad, so there is, by the way, a specific type of chai in Hyderabad. In the old city of Hyderabad, you can go and have chai, but that's called Irani chai. That's not right. So in the Irani cafes of Hyderabad, it's called Irani chai, not Hyderabadi chai. So there is nothing such as Hyderabadi chai. Of course, there's something called Hyderabadi biryani, but nothing such as Hyderabadi chai. So in that sense, it's a little bit of it's unique without sounding too, it takes a little bit of iteration to think about. I thought I was being clever, but I've also got feedback that says it takes up too many characters, man. Shorten your. So please, so it cuts both ways. Yeah.
So, do you guys want to answer this question about what's the first step in learning economics?
I think an intuitive book like the one that Sudipta has written would be great. Just so that you get an idea of, just so that you get a feel of what ideas there exist. And then you can move on to one of the principal's books. Maybe Mankew's book is great. That's what I would say.
So my suggestion is that, what Sudipta is doing is is in a nice tradition. So I think of like the Avinash Dixit as an awesome writer. I think of Kaushik Basu as an awesome writer, right? I think of even like Freakonomics and the Steve Levitt kind of books as amazing books for people who, lots of people never studied economics, never had to suffer through intermediate microeconomics or any, and so folks pick up these books and say, the books don't have any maths. They're very accessible. And I think, all these writers have done a great service to, folks that you can understand a lot of stuff, right? What I'm waiting for is Sudipta to star in a new YouTube series, right? Which guides us through, because, so I think what historians did particularly well is they write popular books. So historians write serious books, they write popular books, and they come up with TV shows, right? There's this whole history channel. I'm waiting for the economics channel, right? And some of my favorite, writers would be on there, no matter.
That sounds like a multi-million subscribed channel.
Yeah.
It must be very addictive. Also, to answer that question, Sudipta has very nicely thought about it beforehand because, he's a great thinker. And we have this thing in the book called suggested reading. So if any chapter catches your fancy and makes you want to read more about it, you have a handy guide making this, giving you another reason to buy this book if you haven't already. Now, talking about authors, like how Tarun just mentioned about thinking strategically, Sudipta, in your book, you have a chapter related to P.G. Wodehouse. What's the connection there? Why is he there? And why, what am I expecting when I enter that chapter?
So, okay, so I have to say, that's the very first chapter I wrote. And I love Wodehouse. I continue to read Wodehouse. So even now, if I have an afternoon where I have some time that I want to read, but I don't want to start a big book, I'll randomly pick up P.G. Wodehouse. I have a few, and I'll start reading, especially the short story collections. Just read a few short stories and you can stop. So I just love his way of writing because, so there are two people who I think are very good with words, who are my favorite wordsmiths. One is Arundhati Roy. It's the plot, for example, the plot of God of Small Things is not necessarily, something one cannot anticipate. In many ways, you can anticipate what's going to happen in the plot, but the writing is just marvelous. And similarly for P.G. Wodehouse, it's the same farce going to be repeated again and again with the same set of characters, Bertie Wooster, Jeeves, so on, or, the other series, P. Smith. But the basic idea is, that chapter was written based on a short story from Wodehouse, which he had written in 1905. And he talks about an American visiting the British countryside. And he decides that the British are very inefficient with the way they do production and their accounting and all of that. So he's going to open one of his stores there. And if you read about that store, it sounds just like Walmart because it sells everything from motor cars to safety pins. Okay. And so the story is about a little mom and pop shop or a little chaiwala in the village who's selling from his, little dhaba his chai. And then this big mall type store or big giant superstore comes there to compete with him. And what happens? That's what the story is about. So in the sense that I wanted to show you that, this trend towards globalization or things we talk about now, it's not, technology has sped everything up. But this whole idea of interconnection and technology playing a role, all of this has been happening for quite some time. So that's what you will find in the chapter.
Great. In the meanwhile, while you were answering that question very seriously, we have two more queries which we've received on chat. First, I'm going to see the pop-up that I'm getting, which is Nirmala says that this is really interesting. Some people claim that economists are responsible for the ills of capitalism, but here we have three wonderful economists who are talking about equality more than anything else. Would you guys like to say something about this? The implication, the long-held belief that economics somehow equals the evils of capitalism, and also, what Tarun was earlier saying about, and also what you said about policy being used in a manner to implement change for the better, where economics also means equitable sharing of resources. So how does that work in, when you have, how do you sleep at night knowing there's an Amazon worth trillions and trillions of dollars where people are suffering? And is there an economic theory that could fix it all if implied?
Okay, I will go very quickly and I'll be very brief because I want to give others. So first, I think economists look at the discipline as a positive science. So which means that we take a given situation, we analyze the given situation, we explain what's going on, right? Economists are not necessarily making policy recommendations. That's a different hat. So when you want to make a policy recommendation, you wear a different hat. There you are taking sides. So there is this common joke about economists that economists will have, if there are 12 economists in a room, there'll be 13 opinions because Keynes will have 2 opinions himself on everything. So that's, first of all, I think it's important to understand that economists, as Tarun pointed out, we are philosophers. So we like to understand what underlies human behavior and we come up with opinions. We explain the situation. We don't decide what to do. The next thing I want to point out that, developing countries have always focused on issues like inequality. This has always been a part of development economics, but developed countries don't. But now inequality has become big, even in developed countries. In fact, inequality is on the rise everywhere. And thanks to, after Thomas Piketty's book, this has become a big thing. And so everybody's talking about it. But I think for the three of us growing up in India, we have always been aware of these issues. We have always been tied to these issues and we have always studied these issues. So there is that difference that people don't necessarily realize, that when you're talking to Indian economists versus, say, American economists, things may be different. We've had our own experience and it matters. Tarun and Pritha?
So I'll just say, because the question said capitalism, we do understand that a lot of core micro that we teach is based on the assumption of profit maximizing or the assumption of person maximizing a more simple idea of utility. So the basic economics that we teach might come across as sort of pushing the fact that firms are only about maximizing profits and consumers are only about maximizing utility, which is very utility of a very selfish nature. But when you dig deeper into economics, which has been happening for a long time now, we've tried to work around all of those things, and we've tried to look at different. That's stepping outside of your econ one-on-one. Economists have been looking at these issues of inequality, as Sudipta says, for a long, long time. And as Sudipta says, it's very salient for us having grown up in India. Like, even though while you're growing up, you often don't understand what's going on. But as soon as you step outside, the inequality sort of hits you, and then those questions start driving you, motivating you to work. Yeah.
So, I think this is a big discussion that we could have about, like, the role of a normative science versus positive science, right? And the particular aspect of what economists bring to the policy table. Economists are there in the policy realm, but my guess is that very few economists have ever contributed anything good to the good policy that comes straight from the economist's mind, right? Because to come up with good policy, what you need to do is to layer on economics, but you also need to have values, ethics, right? Politics, all these things need to be incorporated into policy, proposals before they actually become successful policies. What economists have been remarkably successful at, very extremely successful, is like killing bad policy ideas, right? So let me give an example that I just, have been following for the last week or so, which is this idea that the RBI has floated about allowing industrial houses to run banks, right? So the idea is that Indian economy lacks capital. The existing banks aren't offering enough credit. So let's have the large corporate houses also apply for banking licenses, run banks in the Indian economy, right? But banks are socialist enterprises. Remember that. Why? Because the RBI is willing to lend them unlimited amounts of money at extremely low rates. And if the bank fails, the RBI and the government will come running after them to save a bank in a way that they will never save a corporate, right? So the economists have, I think successfully, or not, at least the arguments have been made excellent arguments against this idea. It's a very bad idea because they've said that, look, industrial houses will basically, privatize the profits and socialize the losses. Plus, we care a lot about inequality. Which industrial houses are going to be buying banks? The largest ones. And now not only will they have a monopoly over market share for customers, but they'll also have a monopoly over all the capital in the economy. And this is soon going to lead to economic and political monopolies. And I think economists have also been very correct in pointing out that monopolies are bad. And
so, in fact, there is research on this about the guanakshi in China and chaibols in Korea. So this is the same type of arrangement that has happened. So if you look at the research that's done there, they actually give you some of the outcomes that you can expect if you implement these types of sort of arrangements.
Right. So I mean that was a great set of answers, and I got a lot of quotable quotes for my Twitter thread, which will make me sound smarter than I am. Unfortunately, though, we're at 6:30 p.m., which marks the end of this conversation. However, as before we actually bid farewell, I would really like if Sudipta could read an excerpt from his book and give us a taste of what lies within. Sudipta,
so I was already expecting this. So I have. So I'm just going to read very briefly the last part of the the introduction to the book. Okay. So So I'm going to skip everything from tea up to lunch because this is like the average life of an everyday life of a person in India. So I'm just going to start with lunch. Okay. Lunch. Jhaji watched the last slice of pizza steadfastly. It was always the same story. Whenever they ordered pizza at work, everyone would pass up the last slice, saying they were completely full. Yet, he knew very well that some of them, like Manas and Tarun, different Tarun, for example, he had seen them eating at buffets and knew their ravenous appetites only too well, were simply pretending not to be hungry. Although he was also a willing participant, he never quite understood the silly farce. In the end, with a twinkle in her eye, Mrs. Khanna would always brazenly grab the last slice of the pie. But today she was on leave, and he wondered what fate had in store for that last piece. Many more such gratuitous stories could be told about people going through their daily business, and quite likely, some of these narratives will resonate with different readers. I could even find little episodes from one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich in his prison camp. In fact, these events could be set in different places at different times and be about people from various walks of life. there is one common thread running through them all. You can find serious economic behaviors in these snippets of life. And in fact, you can read the book in any order you like, except maybe the cake chapters. This is a book about the economics of these small things. Over the course of the book, I will delve into economic concepts behind the events mentioned here and other such phenomena drawn from everyday life. The book invites you to explore these different economic ideas and concepts and to have fun while doing it. And for those interested in exploring these topics further, there's a detailed reading list at the end. Happy reading.
Thank you so much, Sudipta. I think that very happily concludes this conversation, which I hope was very interesting to all those who are attending. On behalf of Penguin Random House India, I'd like to thank Tarun and Preetha for being here. I'd also like to thank Viral for having organized and started the session. I would also like to thank Hiral Patel, who has been very nicely managing all the background work, and to each member of the audience who asked questions and participated very enthusiastically in the chat. Thank you so much. Here's to never having to use cassettes again. Sudipta, any final words before we end?
I just want to say thank you all very much. Yes, and I didn't mention Hiral, so yes, Hiral as well. Thank you, Preetha. Thank you, Tarun. I look forward to many more such conversations and hopefully meeting people in person. If it was a different time, we would have been doing this in person with food and so on. Chai and matri and samosas. So do visit the website and send me questions if you want, whatever you feel like. As I said, there's still a prize for the best question. So thank you all.
And do buy the book. It's available everywhere.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Really, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all. Should I end this session?
Yeah.
Okay. See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.